there are cultural identity losses there as well. And from a climate perspective, there is no credible pathway to 2 degrees that does not include very sharply reducing and then halting deforestation.
Não podemos mais ficar apenas nos debates. A gente precisa agir. Agir também pela questão da nossa sobrevivência. E quando eu falo a nossa sobrevivência, eu não estou mais somente falando da sobrevivência dos povos indígenas, eu estou falando da sobrevivência da humanidade.
Populations of jaguars become isolated, they become weaker, and they become vulnerable to disease and environmental change over time.
Protecting the standing forest is not just one option amongst many, right? It's absolutely integral from a climate perspective.
At Everland, we kind of have quite a simple idea of quality, right? A high quality project is one that genuinely changes the drivers of deforestation.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Edward Smith from Valitera, and I host This Week in Carbon. We're at a moment in the carbon markets where the conversation is shifting, not just from growth, but to credibility and implementation into capital markets. And today's discussion on the Indigenous Amazon Outcome Bond sits right at the center of that shift. We brought a great group together of fantastic speakers who are not only thinking about these challenges, but are actively building and investing in market solutions. So this will be a really thoughtful discussion. I'm super excited, and I thank you all for joining us today. With that said, I'm going to hand it over to Pamela, who will guide us through the conversation. Pamela, over to you.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. I'm Pamela, Everland's president. It's great to see so many of our friends on the call, and welcome to everyone that we're meeting for the first time. I'm going to briefly provide some context and then we'll kick off our panel conversation. Please pop any questions that you have for our speakers in the chat, and we'll hopefully have some time at the end for our Q&A. So the Indigenous Amazon Outcome Bond Initiative was launched almost a year ago and is designed to mobilize large-scale upfront financing for Indigenous and community-centered forest conservation across the Amazon. The initiative aims to deploy around $50 million in capital to launch 20 Indigenous and traditional community-centered forest conservation projects, all that will be verified under the Equitable Earth standard, which we'll learn more about from Thibault shortly. Over the first decade, the portfolio has the potential to generate over $1 billion in revenue from carbon credit sales, with the majority, and at least 70% for all projects in Brazil, flowing directly to communities. I'm very happy that we've already seen strong demands from the demand side, from the private sector, having secured $160 million in letters of intent from companies who are looking to buy credits from the portfolio. And equally, we are overseeing an expression of interest process. Very honored to say that so far, projects representing 17 million hectares of forest and nearly 90,000 Indigenous and traditional community members have so far stepped forwards. You know, on these webinars, we often talk about scale and financial mechanisms and, of course, integrity. But I don't want these words to obscure the heart of this initiative, which is really acknowledging and correcting a global injustice. Indigenous and traditional communities protect 80% of our planet's diversity, but are still receiving less than 1% of available climate finance. And this statistic is more than a statistic. It really reflects a very shameful history of marginalization. So the Indigenous Amazon Outcome Bond Initiative is really about putting resource directly into the hands of the people who've been protecting forests for generations. And it's really about backing Indigenous climate leadership with both respect and capital. So with that front of mind, I'm very happy to introduce our wonderful speakers. Today, we're going to be joined by Puyr Tembe, Secretary of Indigenous Peoples for the state of Pará, Thibault Sorret, CEO of Equitable Earth, Fernanda Ribeiro, Director of Institutional Partnerships at Panthera, Rene Velasquez, who is managing partner at Valitera, and Josh McCarron, my colleague, Senior Vice President and Global Head of Business Development at Everland. We will start with Secretary Tembe. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today. Indigenous peoples have protected the Amazon for generations, yet many indigenous territories continue to face very growing pressure from deforestation and illegal activities. From your quite unique perspective, how urgent is it that indigenous communities receive the resources required so that they can continue to protect their territories?
Os recursos necessários para continuar protegendo seus territórios.
Olá, bom dia, boa tarde. Me atrasei um pouco, tive que ir numa emergência, por isso eu estou dentro do carro, peço desculpa. Dei uma medicação, estou voltando para um lugar que eu possa seguir na live. Bom, acho que essa pauta é uma pauta que não pode mais ser só apenas um debate. Acho que ela precisa ser uma questão de urgência e uma urgência necessária. É uma questão de sobrevivência, não somente dos povos indígenas, mas sobrevivência da própria
I think Puyr
humanidade,
is frozen.
da
I
própria
think not
sociedade em
just for
geral.
me.
Então, eu acho que a gente acredita que... Oi?
Puyr tá travou bastante até o começo da sua fala. Pegou até que você teve uma emergência e que estava no carro. Aí travou. Agora que voltou.
Então, vamos lá. Então, acho que a gente precisa falar dessa urgência, mas e dessa emergência ao mesmo tempo. É porque é uma questão de sobrevivência. Não podemos mais ficar apenas nos debates. A gente precisa agir. Agir também pela questão da nossa sobrevivência. E quando eu falo a nossa sobrevivência, eu não estou mais somente falando da sobrevivência dos povos indígenas, estou falando da sobrevivência da humanidade, de todos nós. Então, é necessário fazer esses debates, é necessário agir, mas é necessário pensar financiamento que chegue na ponta. Esse financiamento que chegue no chão do território, onde as comunidades indígenas possam ter mecanismos próprios de fazer a gestão da sua vida. Pode seguir.
I'm going to translate now. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm sorry I had an emergency and now I am in the car, but thank you for talking to all of you. We have to start to talking about emergency and urgency. It's a fact about the survival, but not only for indigenous people, but all the humankind. We understand the importance of talking, but we need not only talking, but actions. The discussion is important, but we need the direct finances from the floor of the territory, and we need the mechanisms for management of the indigenous people's lives inside the territories.
E quando a gente está falando dessa emergência, é porque essa violência ambiental, desmatamento que tem acontecido, acelerado, ele é um desmatamento que vem matando modos de vida das povos indígenas. E aí a gente está falando do desmatamento, a gente está falando das queimadas, a gente está falando dessa mineração. Enfim, a gente está falando nos modos de vida dos povos indígenas que estão sendo afetados todos os dias.
You just need to unmute.
Sorry. When I speak about the emergency, it's because this environmental violence that is being accelerated. It's a deforestation that has been killing indigenous people's lives. And we are talking about the wildfires, we are talking about the illegal mining that is happening inside the territories, and indigenous people's ways of life, it's being affected.
Isso, eu acho que sem investimento direto, sem autonomia, sem respeito aos modos de vida, de gestão, de qualquer gestão, é um discurso de preservação.
Without the direct investment, without indigenous people's autonomy, and without the respect of indigenous people, these dialogues, without indigenous people's management, these dialogues are empty.
Thank you.
Urgência, câmbio. Thank you.
The urgency it's now because the time of the forest doesn't follow our own time.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that response. It's really important to start with your perspective, and thank you again for joining us. I just want to ask one more question, if possible. There are a lot more companies now that are evaluating how they can support Indigenous-led forest conservation through initiatives like the Indigenous Amazon Outcome Bond, and some of them will certainly be on the call today. Do you have a message that you could share with them, please?
Muito obrigada, Puyr, por trazer tudo isso para a gente. Também gostaria de aproveitar para fazer mais uma pergunta. Iniciativas como o Indigenous Amazon Outcome Bond são concebidas para direcionar investimentos significativos diretamente para comunidades indígenas e tradicionais que protegem suas florestas. O que significa para você projetos liderados por indígenas no centro de uma iniciativa global como essa?
Olha, primeiro eu acho que projetos que falam sobre nós, eles precisam e necessitam que sejam liderados por nós. Acho que esse é um primeiro passo. De qualquer instituição, seja governo, seja empresas privadas, pessoas físicas que se identificam com a pauta, queiram ajudar os povos indígenas, é preciso dar essa autonomia e o protagonismo aos mesmos.
I think it's important for the first of all, the projects that talk about indigenous people, that talk about us, they need to be led by us. Whether it's government, whether it's state, whether it's NGOs, or persons who admire and support indigenous projects and indigenous lives.
Iniciativas como essa, se essa iniciativa faz e leva com que os povos indígenas façam esse papel fundamental de protagonizar a sua própria história, a gente só tem a parabenizar iniciativas como essa, fazendo com que os povos indígenas contem, façam, trabalhem em prol do seu próprio povo. Então a gente parabeniza, porque isso foi uma coisa que a gente sempre quis, sempre buscamos e continuamos lutando por esse protagonismo. Feito, pensado e construído pelas nossas próprias mãos, a partir da nossa própria história. Então, a gente parabeniza uma iniciativa como essa.
If this initiative it leads to indigenous people to accomplish their role, to have the autonomy of their own history, we only have to congratulate this initiative. Because it's something that we have been fighting for our own protagonism for all of our history.
Posiciona, os povos indígenas no centro global e abre caminhos para nova forma também de pensar o desenvolvimento e a conservação.
That puts indigenous people on the center of development and puts indigenous people on their own protagonism of their own story. Tá mudo, Puyr? Tá mudo?
Então, isso também demonstra a capacidade e reconhece os povos indígenas no lugar dessa capacidade de fazer a gestão dos seus projetos, a gestão dos seus territórios, ou seja, o protagonismo dessa gestão territorial, cultural, social de cada povo. Isso sim é fazer justiça climática. Quando a gente beneficia, quando a gente leva para o chão da aldeia recursos que os povos indígenas, recursos dignos, eu diria, recursos que deem condições de fato. A gente não está falando isso se chama recurso justo, ou seja, fazer com que os povos indígenas sejam beneficiados por todo o trabalho que fazem há milhares de anos para o planeta. E aí eu não me atento e não fecho somente nessa pauta ambiental. Eu trago isso para o trabalho que os povos indígenas fazem há milhares de anos. A preservação cultural, ambiental, social, modos de vida no planeta, países que muitos se espelham, que muitos também aprenderam a cultura indígena, seja ela na culinária, seja ela na sua própria cultura, suas festas tradicionais que muitos países têm, e muitos deles são baseados nos modos tradicionais dos povos indígenas, ou seja, são herança dos povos indígenas. Então, assim, a gente tem, de fato, comprovado, mostrado, historicamente, o quanto nós, povos indígenas, contribuímos, não somente com a Amazônia, mas com o planeta.
That demonstrate the capability of indigenous people to manage their own projects, their own territories, and their own protagonism on environmental management. And it's not only environmental management, it's social territory management that each indigenous community produces inside the territory. That is climate justice. When we bring that discussion for the ground of our territories and our villages, we are talking about the resources that indigenous peoples need to continue to exist. We are talking about dignifying resources that has conditions for indigenous people to work. And we need to be beneficiary for all those millions of years of work that we have been doing, but not only environmental, but also for the preservation of our culture and the ways of life on the planet. Indigenous culture is not only on the environment, but in our food, in our countries, in parties, and many festivals in our traditional way. That is our heritage for non-Indigenous people. We show that historically we have contributed for the planet, not only for the Amazon.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Secretary Tembe, and also thank you, Fernanda. I'm really so grateful that you both joined us today, and thank you so much for your strong leadership. We're now going to turn to the role of standards in the voluntary carbon market. As I mentioned, all the projects that are funded by this initiative are going to be verified by Next Gen Forest Conservation Standard, Equitable Earth. I'm therefore extremely happy that we're going to be joined by Equitable Earth's co-founder and CEO, Thibault Sorret. Welcome, Thibault. At the moment, and throughout the history of the VCM, buyers have had many different project types to choose from. Could you talk a little bit about the relevance of forest conservation projects in the market today?
100%. Thank you, Pamela, for having me here. To start with the obvious, the world needs standing forests. Primary forests are irreplaceable. Restoration is super important, but it's not a substitute for ancient, very complex ecosystems. If you think about the ecological relationships of a single multi-100-year-old tree, 1,000-year-old tree, it's irreplaceable if it's lost. From a livelihood standpoint and cultural standpoint, I mean, Puyr his opening words were a testament to that. Losing forests also means losing identities, traditions, way of lives that go beyond just livelihoods that are often reported in the various reports that we look at. There are cultural identity losses there as well. And from a climate perspective, there is no credible pathway to 2 degrees that does not include very sharply reducing and then halting deforestation. But reality is that right now we're not slowing the pace of deforestation fast enough to get to a stabilization point. Historically, there was about 6 billion hectares of forest. Right now, we have about 4 billion hectares left. To give you an idea, that's about 1 billion hectares that we lost over 10,000 years and another billion that we lost in last century. In terms of primary forest, we've got about 1.1 billion hectares of primary forest. So of that 4 billion, only about 1 is still primary forest. Last decade, we lost about 50 million hectares net. So if you look at forest growth relative to forest loss, we're negative 47 over the last decade or so. That roughly means losing an area the size of Paris, about 10,000 hectares every day in net terms. If you think about sort of the carbon markets, we also do a lot of restoration at Equitable Earth. Some of the larger projects that we do on the restoration side that take 40 years to implement are 10,000 hectares. So there is no stabilizing without stopping deforestation. We have to restore what we've lost, but we also have to stop losing as much as we're losing today. Long story short, the world needs to create incentives for forest conservation if we're serious about keeping forests there. And the people who need to benefit the most from those incentive mechanisms are the people doing the work. Puyr talked about it wonderfully, and we're going to go back to it, but we have to make sure that local communities, Indigenous peoples, rights holders are at the heart of that work and at the heart of receiving the benefits from that work, because these projects not only are on their land, but in many cases are theirs. We'll talk about ownership a little bit later too, I would hope. Last point here is the world needs to create these incentives. The world needs these forests, but the carbon markets also need these credits. If you look at REDD+ as a category, it's the largest category for NBS issuances, still about 30% of retirement. And as tech-based reduction credits start to contract, you're going to have less renewable energy credits. The cookstove methodologies are also getting more restrictive, so you might have less of those credits available in the future. As those trends start to narrow the availability of tech-based reduction credits, you're going to need to have something that fills that void. Forest conservation is a great place to start. It's incredibly scalable. In the future, we can also think about ways to generate removals from these forests. A secondary forest that starts to grow back is going to generate massive amounts of sequestration from the atmosphere that's additional relative to areas that would have otherwise been cut. And so that's an area of active R&D for us, is trying to understand how we can both value the reduction in losses, but also the additional sequestration that's coming from protecting and conserving these forests.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting, Thibault. Really great background as always. Thank you. I'm just going to ask you one more question before we move on to Fernanda. There are many companies out there, so potential buyers of credits or investors, and they might be looking now for signals that the voluntary carbon market is perhaps entering a new era of credibility. Could you share, in your view, how Equitable Earth is helping to rebuild that confidence? And I would love it if you could focus on baselines and community engagement in particular.
All right. Well, so the first thing to say is buyers today are much more sophisticated than they were a few years ago. They're no longer mostly looking for price or volumes or compelling narrative. They're going really deep. In practice, what they want is confidence in the baselines. So they want to make sure that the credits are issued against realistic, well-substantiated counterfactuals. So they always have, but this is something that they're really paying attention to. They want stronger assurance around implementation. Something that I've been hearing more and more about is things like risk management and delivery risk are things that buyers are considering more than they've ever considered before. And so they want those risks disclosed transparently, and they want mitigation plans in place. The third is meaningful community engagement. They don't want sort of box ticking exercise. They want this to be a real core condition of long-term. They understand that this is a core condition for long-term success in the projects. And so they want genuine engagement with Indigenous peoples, local communities, whoever is at the heart of these projects. I would posit that beyond engagement, we need to move towards participation, and beyond participation, we need to move towards ownership. I think one of the things that Secretary said, these are our projects, and I think it is 100% right that these community-led projects can and should be owned at their heart by the communities themselves. And so how does that look when a project changes from having communities as stakeholders to communities as core owners? How does that change the dynamic? That's something that I think a lot of buyers are looking for nowadays as well. So how are they checking these things? Well, there's external marks of quality like ICVCM CCPs, and then some of them have internal teams to go assess this sort of at the extra mile. How do we respond to sort of these demands from the buyers? On the carbon side, you've got the baselines. How are the baselines established? Who sets them? And then how is the performance monitored over time? On the social and ecological side of things is how are these elements embedded into the design? Let's go first to baselines. So baselines, you've got a perception of conflict of interest and inflated claims when the project developers are deriving their own baselines. One of the ways that we can help solve that is by centralizing baseline setting at the standard level. So in the Equitable Earth system, it's no longer the project developer that defines the counterfactual scenario. That's centrally set. And not only is it centrally set, it's centrally set in a way that scales up all the way to the jurisdiction. So we derive risk maps at the jurisdictional level and allocate risk spatially. And that's how the projects have their baselines attributed. We then can check using satellite imagery progress relative to those baselines. How are the project doing? How are the projects performing relative to the risk that was anticipated for that area? And if there is performance, only if there is performance, then there is crediting. It's the delta between that baseline and the performance that we credit. So these are performance-based mechanisms. People don't just earn credits because there was a risk there. The risk has to be properly dealt with. And on the community piece, and then we can move on beyond engaging in free, prior, and informed consent, which is obviously very important and required. There should really be a co-design of the theory of change, the objectives, and the intervention plans with the core stakeholders. This should not be an exercise that's done at a desk, handed over, and approved by a community, but rather an exercise in co-design with the communities who are at the heart of the project, taking ownership of that process.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Thibault. I know we could talk about this all in much more detail, so huge thanks for giving us such a concise summary. So moving on to Fernanda, very important focus of the Indigenous Amazon Outcome Bond Initiative will be supporting projects that are located within priority landscapes that have been established by Panthera that form the Jaguar Corridor. We're very happy that Panthera will serve as a biodiversity advisor to the initiative, particularly on apex species like the jaguar. And therefore, I'm delighted to welcome Fernanda Ribeiro, Director of Institutional Partnerships at Panthera, to the webinar. So, Fernanda, Panthera's Jaguar Corridor Initiative is really one of the most ambitious efforts to protect wildlife across the Americas. Could you just start by explaining what the Jaguar Corridor is and why maintaining these connected landscapes at such a large scale are so important for the survival of jaguars and really other species?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Pam. And it's a real pleasure to be part of this conversation, and especially to be in the conversation now amongst friends as we move through this journey together. So the Jaguar Corridor Initiative is a Panthera flagship initiative, so something that is almost part of our DNA. As you said, it is also one of the most ambitious conservation efforts in the world. So it's really about maintaining and restoring connectivity across 18 countries and nearly 6 million square kilometers. So, all the way from northern Argentina to northern Mexico. It's massive. But it's important to understand that what we're talking about is not one contiguous, unbroken corridor. It's more like a living system that is made up of strongholds for the jaguars, what we call the Jaguar Conservation Units. And these strongholds are connected by landscapes that allow jaguars to move around. I guess one good way to try and understand or visualize it is to think of it as some kind of circulation system. So the JCUs, the Jaguar Conservation Units, are like the heart. So these are places where the jaguar populations are very strong and are breeding. And the corridors are like the arteries and veins. So they allow life, in this case, jaguar movement and genetic exchange to happen and to flow between them. But what that also means is that for jaguars, and actually for all big cats, to be able to thrive, protected areas alone is not enough. Because we need movement, we need genetic flow, we need to give them the ability to navigate landscapes that, as we know, are increasingly integrated and fragmented. So going back to the circulation system metaphor, if those connections, are lost, that the entire system starts to break down. Populations of jaguars become isolated, they become weaker, and they become vulnerable to disease and environmental change over time. But on the other hand, when the system is connected, it stays alive, very resilient, and able to adapt, which is really what we're aiming for here. And another key idea to keep in mind when we think about the Jaguar Corridor, it's called the Jaguar Corridor, but it's not only about one species. Jaguars, as always, apex predator, they really function as an umbrella. So protecting the species and their corridor safeguards the entire ecosystem. So we're talking about thousands of species, water systems, and vast carbon stocks, which is quite relevant for this discussion. But also, very importantly, much of the corridor overlaps with human populations. That includes indigenous and traditional territories, which is also key for this conversation. So from the standpoint of the Jaguar Corridor Initiative, connectivity is not only an ecological concept, it's also a social concept. So it's about aligning conservation with the people that have been stewarding these landscapes for generations, as well as with the people that are now shaping these landscapes. And that includes governments, farmers, the private sector, communities in rural and urban areas across the corridor. And that's really what our late co-founder, Alan Rabinowitz, had in mind when he conceived of the Jaguar Corridor, is to move beyond isolated protected areas and create this continental pathway where wildlife and people can coexist across these landscapes.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting. Thank you. I guess moving specifically to the Indigenous Outcome Bond Initiative, why is this type of structure specifically important for long-term protection of jaguars and their habitats?
Yeah, I guess a simple way to respond to your question is to point to the scale, right? So I just talked about the Jaguar Corridor, it's massive. So if we're really serious about addressing a task of this magnitude, we need to find solutions that are at the same level. And, the Indigenous Amazon Outcome Bond Initiative provides exactly that in our sense. It's predictable long-term financing at scale. That's one key point. But then the second very important aspect is that the financing goes straight to the places where it can maximize impact, because the financing that we're aiming to unlock through the initiative is going directly to the indigenous population that for so long have protected and enriched these core points of the corridor. So we are providing an answer that goes straight to the heart of the problem, going back to the metaphor. And because the JCUs that I was talking about, and they're at the heart of the living system, they so often coincide with those indigenous and traditional territories. So for jaguars, putting those two elements, the scale and the fact that we are maximizing impact together, these can be really transformative. But I imagine that for those communities, and listening, Puyr speaking, and thinking about how for so long they have been overlooked and underfunded, these can also be quite transformative. And I think the third element that I wanted to highlight is that because this initiative has these two, pieces at the heart of it, the indigenous communities and their stewardship role, and then the jaguar, and also the fact that these are guardians of the forest, and put them two together, it ends up highlighting the relationship between the two, which is something that, it's hard to put into words. It's hard even for us that is not, part of these indigenous communities to understand, but that is so valuable and holds so much value. Because, deep down, I think that the indigenous communities and the jaguars, they recognize each other as the true guardians of these landscapes. So supporting the two is something that is truly special, I think.
Yeah, it is. It's truly special. Thank you. Last question. From a corporate point of view, because obviously companies, credit buyers are key actors in the bonds initiative, we find that lots of companies still think about biodiversity as separate to their climate strategy. So could you talk a little bit about why protecting biodiversity corridors like the Jaguar Corridor should be seen as, in fact, a core part of a company's climate action?
Yeah, sure. And you're totally right. For a long time, climate and biodiversity have been part of or treated as separate conversations, which, is not very conducive to us finding solutions, because that separation doesn't exist in nature. And to be fair, it's not only companies that do that. Governments do that too, our society, even like us in the conservation sector tend to do too. If you look at the conventions, we have separate conventions for each one of these topics. So it's any structural problem because, it's very simple. You cannot stabilize the climate without protecting ecosystems. And you cannot protect the ecosystems without supporting the people who manage them. So for companies and for our society as a whole, I think this is becoming increasingly clear. Climate strategies that ignore the biodiversity element are simply incomplete or faulty. So to give just one example that relates to corridors and jaguars, just to exemplify, now in Brazil, we're seeing a lot of renewable energy projects growing so much and, being present in a lot of the natural landscapes that we have. To take the Caatinga, it's a different biome in Brazil that's drier forest. The wind new, project, they tend to go to the top of the mountains just because then you can maximize, the quantity of wind that you get. But the top of the mountains was actually the very habitat of the big cats that is still, occur in this landscape, resisted for so long because it's their refuge. So now that the top of the mountains are being taken over by the turbines, wind turbines, they're having to find new pathways. They're drier, they're more dangerous, they're coming in contact with those communities. So something that was supposed to be positive and that we would normally think as a positive thing, as renewable energy, are causing it that will be really hard for us to address on the biodiversity side. So, for people in the conservation sector and people in this room, I think it's quite obvious that climate and biodiversity are inseparable, and you can only address one challenge if you also address the other in a sustainable manner. And companies are starting to realize that investing in these initiatives that marry the two things is also good business sense, because it's not only climate action, it's risk management, and it is also long-term value creation. And once again, I think that's what's powerful about this initiative is that it connects all the dots. So we are talking about indigenous leadership, we are talking about biodiversity at scale, and we're talking about credible climate finance.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's really great to hear. And thank you again for joining us. We're going to turn to our penultimate speaker, to Rene Velasquez, who's managing partner of Valitera, and we're going to hear why buyers are stepping forward to support this work. Special thanks to Rene, who's joining us from Singapore, where it's obviously very much outside working hours. Rene, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us. I'd love for you to start by sharing what motivated you to step forward early and sign this LOI expressing interest in projects that are going to be financed by the Indigenous Amazon Outcome Bond Initiative.
Sure thing. Pamela, thanks very much for that question. Before I jump into that, though, I just wanted to pick up on something that Thibault said earlier, because I just think it's foundational to the whole discussion. Protecting the standing forest is not just one option amongst many, right? It's absolutely integral from a climate perspective. And the way that I think about it is through what I think I'm terming sort of the time value of carbon. Essentially, if a forest is cleared, that carbon is released into the atmosphere immediately. And that's a permanent addition to atmospheric concentrations, and it contributes to global warming today. But if you protect that forest, you're avoiding that emission or those emissions now, and you're preventing that ton of CO2 from entering or ever entering the atmosphere in the first place. And then from a physics perspective, and essentially that just matters enormously because climate change is driven by this cumulative concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the longer emissions sit there, the more warming that they cause. So from that perspective, I just want to reframe, right, the conversation that is often happening in the market, this avoidance versus removals, and just frame it so that avoidance today has got this very, and for people to recognize that it's got a very different impact to removals tomorrow. And I don't want to take away from removals because, like Thibault said, right, there's this cumulative effect here, and these standing forests start to accumulate and remove carbon over time. Certainly, reforestation and regeneration are also really important. We see that as a category in the market, and it's critical, especially for long-term net zero. But I just want to frame it in terms of we cannot afford to lose the standing forest in the meantime, and that's sort of now to answering your question. That's why it's really important. So when we look at initiatives like this, we don't just see it as a market mechanism. I see it as something that's aligned with the underlying physics and also the social component, right, and the cultural component that Puyr talked about with regards to forests themselves. Now to your question, essentially the market's gone through a necessary correction over the last couple of years. And I think, it's fair to say that weak supply just was filtered out. And now the buyers are becoming far more discerning. And Thibault mentioned that in his interlude earlier. What stood out to me here is that this initiative isn't just another project pipeline, but it's actually a structured attempt to address the core issues in the market that the market has been grappling with. So you've got this Indigenous leadership at the center and not as a side narrative. That's really important for us. And then you've got this portfolio approach, which brings to something that I think has been discussed already with some of the other speakers, is around scale and diversification. And then you've got this early buyer alignment piece, which tells us that this isn't a theoretical demand. And so those are three critical aspects. But then I think I'd be remiss not to sort of state the obvious. As a principal trading firm, we also look at this through a commercial lens, right? So opportunities like this give us access from an early access perspective to high quality credits and supply and importantly, optionality on how that supply is positioned and effectively deployed over time. So when we combine all of those three things, we're actually improving market structure. And I think that that's really interesting. And then from a commercial perspective, it's also very interesting. So hopefully that answers your question. I've lost Pamela. I think you might be on mute.
Sorry, you missed my profound comment saying thank you so much. And also thanks for your first comment. Very, very important to point out. We love in our space to choose either or, which doesn't make any sense at all. There's no reason why we shouldn't do everything possible that we can. Thank you so much, Rene. That's great. I'd just like to dive into maybe the kind of conversations that you have with your clients. So when you're looking at opportunities and you're evaluating them on behalf of clients and with clients, how do you determine whether a project portfolio is investable or represents a strong and credible approach to forest conservation? And if possible, how could you highlight some of the things about this initiative that stood out from that point of view?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think firstly, the Indigenous side of things is really important because we look at it from who's actually in control on the ground. And Thibault mentioned around the baseline setting as another component. But for us, we look at it this permanence and delivery ultimately comes down to this local stewardship. So in this model, Indigenous-led as it is not just credible, but it's essential. So that's sort of first point. The second point is how the project is structured commercially. This is a really innovative approach, and it comes down to this old adage in business that you need to align incentives. And so we asked that question: are incentives aligned? And ultimately, is there a clear pathway from capital to credit delivery to revenue distribution? And in this context, the outcome bond structure is really interesting because it starts to solve that, what I tend to term as a timing mismatch. And it's really important because essentially the financing gets deployed and it works its way through to the communities, and those are the local stewards. And then the third bit is how it's managed at the portfolio level. And it's just portfolio management and theory. Ultimately, single projects can fail, but whereas a portfolio approach is what institutions can underwrite. And so when we talk to corporates, for them, it's really critical to not have a concentration risk around individual projects, but having it blended across a multitude of them. And I think this achieves that and achieves it at scale. So all of those aspects together really are what drove us to this. It's a fascinating approach.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Our final speaker now, we're going to move over to my colleague, Josh McCarran, our Everland Global Head of Business Development, is our final speaker. So Josh, welcome. We have had some awesome backgrounds on the Indigenous Amazon Outcome Bond Initiative, but there may be some people on the call who are hearing about just the concept of a outcome bond for the first time. It would be great if you could briefly explain how the financial mechanism of the initiative works.
Yeah, of course. I think at a very simple level, an outcome bond is simply a way to turn future environmental results into funding today for Indigenous communities who are protecting forests. I think the easiest way to understand it is really by kind of comparing it to a normal bond. Imagine a kind of standard 10-year bond facing a development bank or somebody else. You give them $100 million and they give you 5% fixed for 10 years. That means you get $5 million a year every year for 10 years. $50 million, and then you get your $100 million back at the end. In an outcome bond, in our model, essentially an investor says, I'm willing to take a little bit less guaranteed income if it will fund real world impact today. So I'll give up some of that fixed return, that 5%, for a variable return that's tied to impact. So instead of earning, say, 5% fixed, maybe they take 2% fixed every year, and they swap the remainder, that other 3%, for a variable return, which may generate even more than 3%. Maybe it's 4 or 5% it could return, but it could also return nothing. So they're saying essentially, instead of giving me $50 million over 10 years, I'll take $20 million, and that remainder, the $30 million, is given up and invested to establish new Indigenous people and local community-centered forest conservation projects. And the investor now essentially has a return that's tied to the success of those projects. Now, what drives the success of those projects is very tangible. It's carbon credits from protecting forests. Those credits are sold to buyers, and the revenue from those credit sales is ultimately what pays the investor their variable return. I think one of the most important aspects of this mechanism is how it provides no recourse capital to projects, meaning that these communities aren't taking on the kind of traditional repayment risk. If a project was meant to deliver, say, 100 credits, just to keep the math simple, over the life of the bond, and it delivers 100 credits, then it repays the loan in full. But if it only delivers 50 credits, it repays 50%. And if it delivers nothing, then there's no obligation to repay. And that's really critical. Private land projects, often you can pledge the land as collateral. So if something goes wrong, the lender takes the land. And that's why access to finance for those kind of projects is a little easier. But for Indigenous people and local communities, this isn't appropriate or even possible. And it's why funding, I mean, especially at the scale we're talking about, is so difficult to come by. And this is the principal problems that we've been trying to address in this structure. And the result is, capital at the scale and urgency we need. And we heard Puyr talking about the urgency. That's less expensive, more accessible, and better aligned with how the projects work and what these communities need, while giving investors a pathway to returns that are linked to kind of real climate impact.
That is super. Thank you, Josh. I think we'll move now to the buyer point of view. So we get a lot of questions around confidence in project quality and how a buyer or an investor can be assured of it. So could you walk us through the layers of due diligence, the safeguards, the quality assurance that companies can expect when they get involved with projects in the Everland portfolio? And it would be great also if you could kind of highlight the role that Everland plays in bringing the initiative together and really advancing the projects.
Yeah, of course. Be my pleasure. And, this is probably one of the most important questions in the market today. And it's exactly what we've designed this initiative to address. I mean, you heard Rene and you heard Thibault talking about the project's conceptual and quality foundation is so important for its success and for engagement with the market, right? At Everland, we kind of have quite a simple idea of quality, right? A high quality project is one that genuinely changes the drivers of deforestation. It's centered around and is built in true partnership with the Indigenous people and local communities that are doing the work. And it can deliver real measurable outcomes over time. To make that real, we've built over many years what we call our quality and impact framework. This is really just essentially a structured way of assessing how projects are put together. At a very high level, this evaluates 5 core areas. I'd say, legal and land rights, community partnership and consent, governance and capacity, financial strength and viability, and carbon and impact integrity, with the idea that we're able to assess the strength of the project partners, its governance and ability to deliver change, the viability of the project itself, and the outcomes that it generates. Importantly, this isn't like a light touch review. This is a deep institutional grade diligence process across all of these areas. We will visit a project multiple times to get to know the people, introduce ourselves to the communities, get a deeper understanding of what's happening on the ground. But really, I think that what gives buyers confidence isn't that this is just like Everland's view. The quality impact framework is the investment criteria for the outcome bond. That means that each project has to go through multiple independent layers of scrutiny. Everland is doing all of the initial screening of projects. We then do a lot of field-based due diligence. We package that info into a packet for the buyers and for the investors. We provide that along with our assessment of each of these criteria. The bank then runs its own full due diligence process on all the information we provide and their own core criteria. Equitable Earth, the standard, is obviously assessing the project for conformance against its own standard and methodological criteria, along with creating the project's crediting profile. We're also engaging a ratings agency, Silvera, who are going to be providing pre-project assessments and quarterly reports for the duration of the development of the project, along with a full rating once it's issuing credits. And we're bringing insurance providers in to evaluate projects and provide insurance for buyers that want it. And so the idea is that you have multiple checks from different institutions that all have their own incentives to be rigorous. So, the projects don't need to look good. It has to meet these threshold requirements for this capital to be deployed. Because if a project receives investment but doesn't meet the bond criteria, then the issuer is taking on real financial and legal risk. So it creates a kind of much stronger alignment and linkage between project quality and impact and capital allocation than we've seen to date. And that's really what we're trying to do, is create this sense of institutional governance and oversight at a scale that hasn't been present in the carbon markets before. And that's ultimately what gives buyers the confidence, not just in the projects that they're being assessed carefully, but the entire system is built to enforce that quality over time.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And final question for you, Josh. For companies out there that are interested in learning more, in participating in the initiative, practically speaking, what does engagement actually look like? So how do they become involved? What steps do they need to move through from their initial interest through to ultimately purchasing credits? And how can you help them?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so initially we had this wonderful cohort of buyers like Valitera who've been signing kind of pre-market commitments for the projects in this portfolio. We're super grateful to all the people that have done that. And we've been keeping them informed on progress as things have gone along. We're obviously looking to expand that pool of buyers. We're actually at a pretty exciting time because we're getting close to ending the first wave of due diligence. We've kind of separated the investment into different waves because we weren't going to deploy $50 million in one go. And that first wave of projects is the due diligence on the first wave of projects is about to be concluded. So we're going to be sharing information about those projects with the buyers. Once buyers have found the project that they want to support, we then sign an offtake agreement. And for buyers that are able to sign an offtake agreement that's large enough to underwrite the initial investment, we're calling them founding sponsors, and maybe that's $10 million over 5 years. They get to buy the avoidance credits at cost, and they get access to buy the 50% of the removals credits at a discount to market over the duration of the contract. And so we're very happy for anybody who wants to find out more to kind of reach out to us, and we'll take you through the process.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm aware that we just have a couple of questions in the chat, but we would like to hand over to Secretary Tembe for a final statement. So if it's okay with everyone, we'll respond to the questions over email, and that way we also won't have to severely limit the responses. We'll be able to talk in proper detail. Before we hand over to Secretary Tembe and Fernanda, I just want to thank again all our speakers, everyone who joined us on the webinar today. That was really interesting. And also thank you so much to everyone who attended. I'll pass over to Puyr, please.
Puyr, nesse momento, eles vão passar para você para você finalizar. As perguntas que vão estar no chat, eles vão mandar pelo e-mail. E também ela agradeceu pela presença de todos, por todos que estiveram aqui. E agora é com você.
Obrigada, mas eu queria, na verdade, acho que é um pouco fazer uma reflexão com todos nós que estamos aqui, né, para a gente olhar e refletir, sair dessa live pensando, né, que planeta, que mundo queremos. E não é um mundo somente para nós. E quero também parabenizar as empresas que estão olhando para essas iniciativas. Digo, este é um momento de escuta e de escolha. Não se trata apenas de investir, de falar de investimento, mas se trata de posicionamento. E esse posicionamento, ele não pode ter apenas um lado, ele tem que ter vários lados.
First, I'd like to bring a reflection, and I would like to every one of you to leave this life that we are having. I think, what world do you want to live in? Not only for indigenous people, but all the humankind. I like also to congratulate all the companies that are working alongside with indigenous people, because it means to have a position. And that position, it needs to have a lot of sites, not only one specific site.
Apoiar a gestão florestal liderada por povos indígenas, amigos e amigas aqui, exige compromisso com ética, transparência e principalmente escuta. Não queremos parcerias que produzam relações desiguais, ou seja, falar de injustiça climática. Não queremos nada desigual, ou que utilize nossas imagens e territórios como estratégia de marketing. Não. Precisam envolver empresas que tenham compromisso para trazer a verdade que vem dos territórios, os anseios dos povos indígenas. Queremos alianças verdadeiras, onde nosso conhecimento seja respeitado, nossas decisões sejam soberanas e os benefícios cheguem diretamente às comunidades. Empresas que conduzirem desta forma e olharem desta forma, podem ter certeza que terão o nosso apreço, o nosso respeito, a nossa admiração e o nosso trabalho conjunto.
To support the environment in the environmental management, it requires ethic, compromise, transparency, and listening. We don't want partners that reproduce inequality of relationships, the ones that uses our image as a strategic marketing strategy. We need companies that demands compromises and understands our wishes. We want true alliances, and we want that our knowledge be respected and our decisions are autonomous and the funds arrives for the communities. We want the companies to lead that form so they can be sure that they will have our respect, our admiration, if we work alongside together.
Dizer, acho que essa mensagem ela precisa ecoar, né? Ecoar com os colegas que aqui, mas ecoar para nossas vidas. Se vocês estão dispostos a caminhar conosco, então, proteger a floresta e proteger o futuro de todos. Esse futuro só será possível se for construído com justiça, respeito e com os povos indígenas no centro das decisões. Quero aqui, para finalizar, muito obrigada pelo espaço, obrigada pela escuta, obrigada por estarem conosco, por chamarem a gente para estar participando deste momento, mas não somente este momento. Envolver cada vez mais os povos indígenas no centro do debate, no centro das decisões, centro das construções. E eu estou aqui super disponível para qualquer momento possível, trazendo a voz, primeiro a minha voz enquanto mulher, enquanto liderança, enquanto ser humano, mas também enquanto secretária de Estado de Povos Indígenas, a primeira mulher indígena nesse estado a estar secretária, mas acima de tudo como mulher indígena. Saibam, a gente quer construir, a gente quer defender, mas a gente quer ser protagonista na nossa própria história. E volto a finalizar. Parabéns pela iniciativa, parabéns a todos os envolvidos. E é isso, é colocar nós no lugar certo, no momento certo, na hora certa, no processo do protagonismo, que não pode mais ficar para trás. Thank you so much. Muito obrigada a todos e a todas.
To sum up, I'd like to say that this message needs to echo for our lives. If you guys are willing to walk this path with us to protect the forest, to protect the future of us all, it needs to have justice, respect, and indigenous people in the center of decision making. To sum up, thank you so much for the space. Thanks so much for the listening, and thank you so much for being here and participating with us. Not only in this moment, but to involve indigenous people in the center of the discussions and build other paths. I'm here. I'm super available to build that with you and to bring a voice of as a woman, as a leadership, as a human being, but now as a secretary of Indigenous People, the first one as a woman. We'd like to build, to defend, and we want to be the key actors of our own path. And congratulations for the initiative, for all of us that is involved. And it is the moment to put us in the right place, in the right time, and we can get behind. Indigenous people can get behind that. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you so much. Not every day we get to hear from an Indigenous leader on a virtual call. So really, thank you for sharing your perspective. And we appreciate everyone for joining us today. We'll share the recording shortly for everyone who might have not been able to make it. But thanks again, and we'll see you next week on This Week in Carbon.